Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention and welcome back. We continue the program for this morning. Thank you as well for our participants online for your patience. Coming next, we are going to have a session and discussion on EU-China trade relations. And we are very honored to have Yes, Eva, to have Ms. Eva Valle, Head of Unit Far East at the Directorate General for Trade, DG Trade at the European Commission, who will share with us more on EU-China trade relations, on trade policies, trade negotiations and agreements with China. But our audience today are also a majority of which are trade promotion organizations, business support organizations. For our audience, it will also be interesting to learn from your perspective, Eva, on a series of relevant topics, including also outcomes of the recent visits from the Vice Presidents, HRVP of the Commission, from the commissioners to China, but also on the high-level economic and trade dialogue, and what are the implications for businesses, for business owners, for SMEs in Europe, in China already, or who has a supply chain with China or exporting to China. After the speech from Ms. Eva Valle, we also have two other panelists joining a panel discussion. For further discussion, we're honored to have Ms. Lynn Roethaus, the Director for European Institute for Asia Studies, and also Mr. Tudor Fabien, who is a policy advisor to INTA Vice Chair and MEP Uriel Winkler. Without further ado, I'm passing on the floor to Ms. Eva Valle. Eva, the floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me this morning here. I'm very honored and very flattered after the fantastic speakers that you have had this morning. So I feel I step into very big shoes. I wanted to start by sharing my initial impressions of China when I started working on China, which was, I think, 8 or 9 years ago. I always felt that the level of optimism that companies were displaying when engaging on China and governments was not fully justified. And it always surprised me that there was something that was a little bit off. It wasn't that the GDP wasn't there. Indeed, China has been on a fantastic trajectory. It still has GDP growth that many of our countries would very much envy. It wasn't either that it didn't have an enormous population of 1.4 billion people that could potentially be fantastic consumers. So it's a great consumer market. It wasn't also that it hadn't been following a trajectory which was of indeed reform, market-driven reform and opening up. It had been taking place over the years. And it wasn't either that it didn't have the right infrastructure, the right skills, because it had all of that, or that China wasn't innovative, contrary to what many people that do not know China think. China is very innovative, and the Chinese companies are very innovative. So it had a lot going for it. And yet I felt that there was a degree of over-optimism and remove from reality that needed correction. And why? I think I'm speaking here to people that know China. But if you didn't know China, you didn't realize that China has always opened selective opening of its market. Too little, the European Chamber of Commerce always says. They open when they need a certain technology, a certain product, a certain company. Sometimes too late, they also say. They open when they no longer fear any competition. I think it is the most protectionist market I've ever come across. This being said, I haven't worked on other countries like India or African countries, etc. So I only know China. But it strikes me as incredibly protectionist, which is what they always accuse us of doing. And I find very often with China, to understand where they're going, you have to hear what they accuse you of. They've always operated this selective opening and with conditions that are not the same as the Chinese companies endure or enjoy in the European market. In China, you will never be a Chinese company. If you establish yourself in the European market, according to the rules of our member states, you will be treated as a domestic company. But in China, this will never be the case. You will always be a foreign invested company, subject to separate sets of rules and conditions. You will only be able to invest in the areas that are in the negative list, which apply not only for foreign companies, but sometimes also for private companies. So the level playing field is also not there with respect to state-owned enterprises. And you will only be able to invest in the conditions that the Chinese allow, very often with joint venture requirements. They forced arranged marriages with a state-owned enterprise. And very often the price to pay is the technology. And I think the companies were thinking, maybe that price is okay, because, okay, I hand over my technology, but I have access to this fabulous market. But I'm not sure that they were realizing that that fabulous market was not all for them to take, that they're facing a very nationalistic, increasingly nationalistic population, a lot of barriers, not only once you access the market, but once you are there. There's no level playing field. You have discriminatory enforcement of rules or regulations that also the Chinese companies, the private Chinese companies also face with respect to the state-owned enterprises, as I said before. And sometimes you face this selective closing of the market. So you've transferred your technology, your joint venture partner is making a lot of money, everything is working together very well. And after a few years, your joint venture partner will set up another company with the same technology or sometimes improved, and it will start competing with you. And then you will be out of the Chinese market. And maybe you will also be out of third country markets where your former partner competes with you and outbids you, maybe with the help of some state guarantees. So the imbalance is enormous. This is not the same situation in the European market. China has long been justifying this as a developing country. But I think when we see the level of technological development and the second largest economy in the world, it is very difficult to think that this is a developing country and to justify this level of protectionism in the name of development. The European Union has always been supporting investment abroad for the growth and jobs that it brings back home. And we never wanted to close our market. What we wanted is that our European companies would be able to benefit from the same welcoming conditions that the Chinese companies have very long been receiving or benefiting from in the European market. We've been engaging with China throughout the years. I'm sorry, I tried to speak a bit further away so that it doesn't hear these beeps. So we've long been engaging with China, and we've been calling on them to rebalance the relationship, both on the trade and on the investment front. I described the situation on the investment front as very imbalanced. Our market is essentially open, whereas the Chinese market is essentially closed. And our market ensures transparency and level playing field for all actors. All actors in the market are subject to the same rules and regulations, including our state-owned enterprises that we have plenty. And that is not the same situation over there. In the field of trade, we also have a huge imbalance. And that is due to some structural features and, I would say, distortions in the Chinese economy. Chinese economy has traditionally been always supporting the supply side. Subsidies, not only subsidies, sometimes also regulatory advantages, and it's the manufacturing. They've always been very much focused on becoming the factory of everything and then on going up the value chain. So there has been a lot of support going to the supply side. And when that support is not absorbed domestically, and there has been always a structural issue, I think, with consumption in China that now is enormously exacerbated because of other reasons, structural reasons, and also the problems with the real estate crisis. When the capacity is not absorbed domestically, then what do we do with it? They push it outside. This also works very, very well because exports are the only lever of growth that is now currently working in the Chinese economy. They have problems with the real estate, they have overinvested in infrastructure, and they have, as we explained before, depressed demand. So in order for the economy to grow, it relies on exports. And those exports go out with state support down the path of least resistance to the most open economies in the world. And ours is amongst really the most open economies in the world. Those exports, particularly when they're subsidized and with state support and arrive in our markets, they make terrible havoc in our domestic industries. So we have a political imperative to protect them. We would rather not do it this way. We would rather that China rebalance its economy. And we're trying to engage with China also in that respect, in discussing on macroeconomics and help support it with our advice. And we went to China, to the high-level economic and trade dialogue, and this was one of the messages that EVP Dombrovskis passed. First, that the situation is very imbalanced and it's urgent to correct it. And again, we would rather correct it not with trade defense measures, but with engagement, with discussing on macroeconomic policies, with helping share experiences. And we did restart dialogues on macroeconomic and on financial issues. And we hope that that avenue will also lead. But I do not think that it will lead to immediate results in the short term. So we will have to continue to protect our industries where necessary, to protect our long-term competitiveness. I wanted to, when people tell me about what was the main outcome of the AGD, I always explain that for me, the most important and the highest value of it was the engagement per se. And you will have heard from the colleagues from China that are holding this conference here, that it's almost an emotional tone. They were cut off from the world for very, very long during the COVID period. It was really very tough. I was there in China. I didn't see my mother in 1.5 years, and I was privileged because I was a diplomat and I could, to a certain extent and with difficulties, travel back and forth. But people were really very much locked up in China. And during that period, well, even before, but during that period, I think it reached almost frenzy. The search for control and secure the information and control the propaganda, control the information was so extreme that China really was very, very much cut off the world. And it has lost, I think, to a certain degree, the capacity to understand how it is perceived from the outside world, how the West reads its actions, notably with respect to its engagement with Russia and how we feel about it, because the war in Ukraine is a war in our continent that is imposing enormous costs in terms of lives, but also in our economies. So it was very important that EVP Dombrovskis traveled to Beijing to pass this message directly to the Chinese leadership, because otherwise they would just not hear such a message. So engagement is important, and it was important that he went there and he engaged with them in person. But the other message that he was passing is that engagement without results just takes away legitimacy for further engagement, that it is important that we can start to rebalance that relationship in a meaningful manner. He came out with some results in the field of market access that interests us all. In the field of infant formula, which sounds a little bit banal, but baby milk is 18% of all of our agri-food exports and is 3 billion euros a year. So it is not that banal. We also came out with some promises that domestic companies, that foreign invested companies will be treated as domestic for the purpose of procurement of medical devices. We set up a series of procedures with which we hope that we will be improving also the market access for cosmetic companies, and for all companies in general in the field of data flows, which is an area of huge concern that the European Chamber of Commerce in China drew to our attention as very important. We came back with a little bit of rebalancing, but it is not a significant rebalancing of the relationship. We also discussed de-risking. And the message, and I insist on it, de-risking is not decoupling. The European Union does not want to decouple from China when we are so dependent on China for so many raw materials, for so many products, for so many inputs. It would be absolutely crazy to try to cut ourselves off China. That is not what we are seeking. What we are seeking is a rebalancing of our risks, or a reduction of our risks, in line with what any responsible policymaker would do. It would be tremendously irresponsible towards our stakeholders, towards our citizens, to continue to have risks in our economy and in our supply chains. So we're trying to reduce those risks, not putting all our eggs in one basket, which I think is very reasonable, avoiding bottlenecks that sometimes can happen, like when we had a shortage of magnesium last year for a series of circumstances, and that affected the whole supply chain, and to avoid choking points. And indeed, we did tell China that with respect to the choking points, that it can also help dispel the perception of risk by refraining from weaponizing supply chains. We did bring to the attention of China that the blocking of all the imports from Lithuania, the blocking of exports of artificial graphite, or the export controls that they have set up on gallium and germanium, send very, very chilling effects on everybody. And it doesn't help think of China as a reliable trading partner. On de-risking again, I think there are two sets of areas where we want to de-risk, or two reasons why we want to de-risk. One is the hardcore security. And for that one, we will be using export controls, the traditional dual use type of tools, and investment screening. And then for more soft economic de-risking, it's about increasing the resilience of our supply chains, about diversifying, building stocks and other type of things. It is difficult because China does not want to be de-risked. China has said very, very clearly that they want our foreign companies to be more and more embedded in the Chinese supply chains, more dependent on China, whereas they try to be self-sufficient and not dependent on the rest of the world, which is, again, a very imbalanced proposal for any trading partner. And they are out there on a charm offensive. I'm sure that you will have also experienced it, reassuring investors that China is the place to be, that China wants foreign investors, that they cherish this relationship, that you should come and invest more into China. But it is a little bit complicated to follow blindly, and not because of the growth prospects. Yes, China's economy is decelerating, but it still has very good growth prospects. But more because it's very difficult to invest into a black box. And China is more than ever a black box. Now, it's not only that you cannot search on Google when you are there about prospects, but more and more pieces of information are considered now national security. And consultants have increasing difficulties to do their job. If they report anything beyond what one can read in the China Daily, they can get into trouble. And a serious company cannot make a decision based on what you read in the China Daily. So my final point today is the value of the SME Centre, precisely in that respect. I would never advise anybody to engage or disengage. This is also not the role of the European Union. We do not do trade and investment promotion. I'm not advising anybody to pull out of China or not to go there. But go knowing, make sure that you do your research properly, that you know what you're getting into, that you know the risks, and that you have a strategy to mitigate those risks, that you know well the market in which you are getting into, and the partners and the regulatory constraints and the perspectives and etc., that you make a real good comprehensive risk assessment. And the EU SME Centre is there to precisely help small and medium-sized enterprises in doing this research, in getting the information, in getting a proper assessment. They are there. So they can tell you what the situation is on the ground, and they can help you, put you in touch with partners that know, that have gone through that. They told me yesterday that they have, I don't know how many hundreds of market access fishes, from dog food to cybersecurity. That struck with me. And they can also help you put in touch, or help to put you in touch with the EU IPR help desk. That also helps protect the intellectual property rights of particularly small and medium-sized enterprises, which is super important. So whatever you do, go knowing into China, and I'm very glad that the EU SME Centre puts up this conference today. I think it will be very helpful to assess EU SMEs in the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva, for your sharing and also your kind words about what we do here at SME Centre. I'm going to quickly introduce the two panelists who are joining us for this discussion on EU-China trade economic relations. First of all, we have Mr. Tudor Fabian, who is a policy advisor to MEP Winkler and a standing rapporteur on China and Taiwan, working in the European Parliament since 2015. Tudor is also coordinating the International Trade Working Group of the SME Europe, an SME advocacy body in Brussels, and being the co-founder of the Brussels China Cabinet, an informal platform for China experts in the EU. Tudor, please welcome to the stage. And our third panelist for this session will be Ms. Lynn Goethaus, who is the director of EIAS, European Institute for Asian Studies. Lynn is also associate researcher and lecturer on EU-China political economic relations at ESSCA, School of Management, EU Asia Institute in France. Between 2013 and 2018, Lynn was based in Beijing, conducting research on EU-China relations. And as the director of EIS, Lynn also manages the project, publications, events, and other activities, while closely following the latest developments on EU-China affairs. Lynn also has a keen interest in EU politics, on China, EU-Asia political and diplomatic relations. Lynn, welcome to join us on the stage. Panel discussion by inviting Tudor and Lynn to comment on Eva's sharing or the position we set for our discussion for today from your different perspectives. Maybe Tudor, you want to go first?
All right. Thank you very much. Nice to see you, everybody. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I mean, if Ms. Valle's shoes are large, you can imagine mine. I'm honored to be here, and I will take a couple of minutes to discuss a little bit the position of the European Parliament in this whole debate. I unfortunately or fortunately agree with many things that Eva said, but that would make for a boring debate. So I'm going to try to give a couple of nuances here and there. The European Parliament's position is important, not only because it has one of the final says in terms of trade agreements in the consent procedure, ratifying yes or no any kind of trade deal that the European Union does, but also because it is largely shaped and it shapes European public perceptions. This also in turn then of course influences largely consumer behavior. So I guess that's also important for many here in the room. This mandate started on a rather positive note. We ratified the European Union-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement and Investment Protection Agreement, which was a showcasing example that you can have rules-based agreements with countries with different systems. This was very important for us in the new paradigm of sort of democracies versus autocracies. We always said it's okay if it's rules-based versus non-rules-based. If everybody agrees on the rules, it's not a problem, and if the rules are respected, of course. we went to a bit of a positive note afterwards on China with the GIs agreement that we had, the Geographic Indications Agreement in 2020. It did show in Parliament, you saw this with Vietnam and then also with the GIs agreement, that there was a push from Parliament side on trade and sustainable development. So it took us into the, let's say, paradigm of the coupling between trade and sustainable development, or trade and human rights, more importantly. This was something that Parliament has really took a close attention to. Then we went on to the negotiations of the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, which we were pretty excited about, other than ruining my 2020 Christmas. But it once again showed that there was willingness on both sides to not only sit down, but also agree on things. Of course, enforcement was something that we were always looking forward to get more information about. But it was addressing exactly some of the things that Eva was touching upon on level playing field, on SOEs, on technology transfers, these sorts of things, while also, carving out quite an important bit on sustainable development. Then once we reached this plateau, we started going downhill quite rapidly with the sanctions that came in. So indeed, well, one could say that yes, China is indeed a black box, and many of us here in Brussels don't fully comprehend what is going on in China. But the sanctions showcase to us that also on the Chinese side, there was not a full comprehension of how the European Union works, because going after individual MEPs in the European Parliament and the special subcommittee and some of the decision-making bodies in Brussels was obviously highly detrimental to any kind of bilateral deal-making and will to make a deal. We went to COVID, which showcased not only that people-to-people contacts are very difficult to be replaced by a screen, but also that dependencies are exploitable and they will be exploited when push comes to shove. So we went from the paradigm of trade and human rights and sustainable development towards the paradigm of trade and security. Which we're seeing more and more, and once again, this was brought up on the securitization front. So slowly, there was more and more discussions about decoupling, which, particularly on our side, the Standard Rapporteur on China and Taiwan, also as a former trade minister, was not fully on board with, because when you don't talk, you can't even begin to understand the other party, but also you cannot even begin to try to get to any kind of agreement to solve any kind of issues. Then we had a bit of a Russia spillover, with many in Parliament basically putting an equation mark between China and Russia. This was, of course, helped by some of the movements in Beijing, but definitely, once again, the will to move in any kind of a positive and constructive direction was undermined. Again, as mentioned, we had the move towards de-risking, which was very welcome by us. We said that we cannot try to solve anything if we don't engage. So engagement was definitely a big part of what we were trying to do. Nevertheless, the situation was very complex and rather grim. We are very happy that the HED took place now, and we're happy that there is positive movement. However, substance is the name of the game, and sometimes we would like to see, definitely from the Parliament side that loves to pass a bunch of resolutions and things and whatever's, to move beyond the Brussels buzzwords and all the different kind of little catchy headlines, to actually move towards something concrete that is helping the situation on the ground. I don't want to continue blabbering, but getting to some of my conclusions. Very happy to hear, and once again, I'm in full agreement with my colleague from the Commission here, understand what you're getting into. So risk management is something that we've really sort of hammered down, that this is super important, it needs to be done. Indeed, we're moving away from the paradigm of efficiency towards the paradigm of resilience. This is again on the backdrop of everything that happened with the coupling of security and trade. And invest maybe more in strategic foresight. So look at analyses of what is expected to come. How is the regulatory and legal environment developing? And here, particularly for SMEs, I want to highlight, some of the issues that we've been having a bit of a mea culpa in some sense in the European Parliament, saying that there is a regulatory overburden that is coming in. There are so many different things that need to be taken care of in terms of due diligence. Now we just passed in the Committee Forced Labor instrument. We have deforestation, we have foreign subsidies. I mean, we have so many different things that companies have to do. And while some of these things might be easier for bigger companies that have big legal units and legal experts, it will be very difficult for smaller SMEs, which impacts then competitiveness. So once again, I want to commend the SME Centre for the help that they bring in terms of translating some of the legal requirements, not only on the Chinese side, but I think it's important also to be mindful of these things on the European Union side, because should you want to bring some of your stuff back, then you need to be mindful of all of these issues. So the situation is very complex. We need to keep on talking, and we're happy to keep on talking. So I'm happy to pass on the floor and then answer any kinds of questions that you might be having. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, of course, after these very comprehensive also, I mean, sets out of what is taking place at the moment, of course, it's probably my duty as a non-official to come up with more like questions. I mean, maybe I've looked at my contribution here more as like a part of a discussion as well. And looking at the perspective from the SME side specifically, is like all of that, what does it mean for an SME? Who is already in China or who wants to invest in China. And I think, well, as you mentioned, of course, I think the engagement and the fact that there is dialogue again after this entire time of COVID and difficulties of like the physical decoupling, and therefore also probably in the set of the mind in how to understand each other and how to work together again. I mean, we've seen since the first visit by Mr. Scholz in, I think, almost a year ago now, we've seen, I mean, this dialogue being back up and running, but indeed, how can we actually bring it to the next level? And what, and actually, I mean, how can we get to those results? You've mentioned, of course, also the aspect of de-risking in particular. I think on the European side, we're already still struggling a bit of like how we actually want that to be implemented. Also for, I mean, companies that are already in China or that are, I mean, looking into investing there, how can they actually mitigate that, or how can they look into that aspect of de-risking and bring that into practice while still being there? So that creates some sort of difficulties. I think over the past couple of years, we've mainly seen an increased politicization and a securitization also of EU-China trade relations, which has not made things easier. Of course, I mean, you've already mentioned the aspects of Russia, of other aspects, but also like changing environments within Europe and in China, regulatory frameworks that are changing. And I think of course, from the EU perspective, what we would like to see is much more of like a stable, I mean, safe and fair environment in China, which is viable for investments and trade. The volatility that we have seen over the past couple of years, and maybe even decades to a certain extent, is difficult to manage. So I think that is one of the first things that we might want China to, I mean, secure to a certain extent, that we know what we can expect. And I think on the EU side, of course, we are reacting to that very often, rather than we might be actually be proactive sometimes. So to that extent, it's more like, how can we actually mitigate that? And how can we work together to make sure that that stable environment is being created, which is not easy, of course. So it remains a question at this point. I think, of course, we have seen over the past, I mean, in contributions this morning already, a very different points of view. I think the main thing that I took away from it is that the aspect of competition is much more, I mean, in view at the moment. And of course, the triptych on the EU side remains in place. So that means that China is considered both as a partner, but also as a competitor and as a systemic rival. But of course, if you are an SME, that is a difficult thing to mitigate. How can you work with someone at the same time as seeing them as a rival and a competitor while still wanting to partner with them? And from a policy perspective, of course, that is a completely different aspect than when you're actually working on the ground, working with these trading partners or investors. so that's maybe a first question on my side, and like how to mitigate that from the SME perspective. And you probably have been working on that a lot recently as well. So maybe you can also comment to a certain extent on that aspect later on. I think there's also like a major difference between the MNCs, so the big companies, the multinationals, and the SMEs, which are smaller, medium enterprises, which very often do not have the capacity very often to deal with different frameworks, regulations, also on the EU side to a certain extent. So I think there is a big difference between, or how to look at like how they need to advance stuff in China or not. I think on the other hand, also there's a question of whether companies are already in China. And for them, of course, the choice is whether to stay in China to produce for China, to still continue to produce also for a global market, or on the other hand, for EU companies only wanting to export to China. So I think these three different things are very different choices, and to a certain extent also dilemmas that are in place. So, it's a question of de-risking or decoupling in certain fields as well versus engaging. So how can you keep on engaging within that framework? I think also the ones that have wanted to really leave and that were already there probably have during COVID, but the ones that have decided to stay, I think they need to really adapt to the situation on the ground on a continuous basis, which is very tiresome sometimes. And I think right now, one of the other dilemmas is also between greening and screening. So you have a lot more screening mechanisms, but on the other hand, you also have the aspect of the greening measures, like seabank deforestation and others, which may not be viable for all of them, but how to actually look at that from also like in China, which is not always easy, especially the greening aspects and those things. I think to a certain extent also like the keywords that have come up recently, or not always recently, but have been very much on spotlight, are balancing powers and balancing trade relations, the reciprocity, which has been on the agenda for, I don't know how long, but very long indeed, leveling that playing field, but also trust and predictability. And I think the trust and the predictability aspects are much more in the spotlight, in recent years than it used to be before. I think the other ones have been there for a very long time. But how to rebuild that trust, which I see that has really been lost over the past couple of years. I think then, of course, there are a few things that are very high on the agenda besides the trade balancing. And I think that's about standard setting. So how can you actually ensure that there's no two different worlds that we're building right now, and to actually make sure that like there's common frameworks that we can still work on together? Because I don't think anyone would benefit from completely decoupled standards and settings there. Of course, we have the technology aspect as well. We've seen now with the EVs how complicated that is. Other aspects as well. How can we make sure that we can still work with China in the technology field with a lot of trust being lost? So that's probably one of the biggest questions that will be coming up in the next couple of years. And I think also with the EU elections coming up, what can we expect? And I think one of the main elephants in the room remains the US. We haven't really mentioned it that often this morning, but of course the US-China trade rivalry is key. And of course, how do we need to deal with that from the EU perspective, especially with the US elections in store? Not an easy question, of course. So, what should SMEs do, and how can they actually react to what's going on at the moment? How are you guys supporting them? And which sectors can we still, easily look into, like, without too many risks? And of course, then there's the KAI. The KAI seems to be off the table for now, but what could be still possible in terms of a potential, maybe light version or something else in terms of an agreement? So Eva, I think that is the main question for you.
Plenty of questions and all very, very valid and very good. I really fantastic. I cannot give you answers to everything, but I'll give you a few pointers from my perspective. Rebalancing and reciprocity have been on the agenda for way too long, just way too long. The situation was imbalanced and it has got worse. And there was no reciprocity, and that has not improved. I think it has exacerbated. And despite engagement throughout decades, I would say, we haven't delivered a tangible rebalancing. And these were the messages that EVP Dombrovskis was passing to his counterparts. It takes two to tango. There's so much that the EU can do. But if China doesn't want to actually open up and give the market forces a decisive say in its economy, one cannot force it. One cannot force it. And that is what we're seeing. China has a very different economic system. There was for a while the hope that China's economic system would converge more towards ours. I don't think that we have that hope anymore. So now it's about managing the relationship and managing the difficult outcomes of that relationship. What I have learned in my few years working on China is that it will only open when it wants to open. So there's only so much that one can do. But we did pass a message, and I think it is sad. If engagement doesn't deliver some tangible rebalancing, we will lose the capacity to continue to engage. Many other things that you brought up, the increased politicization and securitization of trade and investment relations. I don't even know what to, how can companies in China deal with all of this? And you were talking about the companies that are already in China or the companies that want to invest in China. And I think the situation is very different. Because the companies that are already in China, hopefully they have done their research and they know the market situation from firsthand. So then they have to face their choices. But I don't think it is black and white. It is not about staying or leaving. There's a lot of nuances, and it all depends on the sector of where the company is active and the strategy that it has put forward. So there's no one answer that fits it all. In any event, I tried to check what companies were leaving, and one thing that I discovered is that companies in China do not officially leave China. They downsize, and they sometimes leave some sort of representation office, but very, very few of them actually leave. And it's not only because it is really actually very difficult to pack your assets and leave and repatriate money out of China. It's also because of fear that it becomes politically sensitive. So they do not officially leave in most cases. Yes, and then you have a choice to be in China for China, which is I think what most companies are actually doing. They used to be in China to manufacture for the world. I think that is not the majority model right now. Also, as China's labor costs have gone up and China has tried to go up the value chain, there's some production that has moved out, and so they are in China for China. Those wanting to invest in China, as Tudor said, they have to invest in better risk assessments, in strategic foresight, in making sure that they know what they're doing. Again, SME Centre can help them. But yeah, but it all depends on sector by sector. And not you ask, how can a company engage with China systematically as a partner, as a competitor, and as a rival? I mean, you don't have these notions that in every aspect of every relationship with China. Again, it depends on what market you are doing. What is it that you're doing? So companies selling luxury products or companies selling food products to China, normally they have very little to worry. Companies that are on sectors that can be tech, that can be the higher the tech and the more edgy the tech, then it's much more complicated. you fear the competition from China, and then there's also the aspect of rivalry and of security and of dual use. It depends very much on the sector in which you are. I cannot give you any answers for everything. It's just case by case basis, but invest in understanding well what you're getting into.
Thank you very much. Okay, many things to unpack. I want to start with this clear idea that there's no black and white answer. There's a lot of nuances, and we do see a lot of companies indeed not only leaving China, but some of them are doubling down. So you see, I don't want to give any names, but you see some examples where the investments are really boosted. And rather often, I feel like this is also because of, let's say, security reasons or resilience reasons, because you want to build a China-only supply chain that you can, have it there, but also be at the liberty of chopping it off should the time come. So this is where geopolitics comes into the entire discussion. And I think that we should definitely, especially after what's been going on with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, to definitely calculate this into many analyses that are being done. On standard setting, I think this is a fundamental area. I did my PhD on hybrid interferences and looking at the normative battleground. So where you look at not only what is being produced, but how it is being produced, that can become the new demarcation line of non-tariff barrier. And to also have a massive impact on how things are being used later on. So in this sense, it is also very important for the European Union to be there, to be at the table, to engage not only with China. So China policy is not only what we do directly bilaterally with China, but also what the European Union does globally speaking. So not only Global Gateway, but also many other partners across the globe, to be there to discuss this issue of standards and to discuss fair competition and sustainable development, security, so on and so forth. Yeah, this what you mentioned, that we might end up having two different worlds. To some extent, I feel like we are in this situation where we're having two different worlds, if not more different worlds, but definitely two big ones are developing. And there's implications across the board, and companies definitely feel this. And I feel like it goes against the instinct of the companies to also sort of account for this before it's too late. And we have some examples where companies were not willing to account for these factors. On the elections, this is clearly directed to our side. It's very interesting what is happening. There is a cognitive dissonance at some level, because, for instance, this morning we just passed in the International Trade Committee an opinion to the Security and Defense Subcommittee on security-related aspects of Chinese investments in European critical infrastructure. More and more, there is awareness about some of the security risks that are linked to some of these investments. There will be an opinion coming up on a European port strategy that also discusses specifically a port infrastructure and commerce. You see that more and more people are aware of this, but at the same time, everybody's on TikTok, or many people are on TikTok. Many people want to, have access to cheap technology. That, frankly said, it works. It's efficient, it's reliable. But the big question here comes: what happens with the data? So this is a major discussion that we're having also on the EV field, and it's not directly linked to the issue of subsidies or fair market competition, but to what happens with the actual data. And I feel that there will come a tipping point at some point where consumers will be a little bit more cautious in this field. But it differs a lot across the European Union. Again, no black and white solution. You see some member states that are more keen to take up some of these things and others less so. On the elections, I feel like on the backdrop of everything that's been going on post-COVID and on the green field, on the sort of hyperpolarization that we live in, the election results will be very complex. And everybody's saying that, okay, Parliament might shift towards the right, which generally speaking is good for companies. But also we have to be mindful of how far we go on the right spectrum. So that will impact things. And definitely I feel like, yes, the big impact will come from Washington. So whatever will happen there will certainly influence things to a very large extent. And even us in the European Union, I feel like there has been a lot of, let's say, sometimes informal, sometimes more in your face pressure from DC to, pick a side. And again, we're combating a lot this black and white and sort of 1-0 mentality, but it's difficult. And so, for instance, we're passing things such as the economic security strategy. It's not only about what we do on the defensive, but it's also what we do in terms of the offensive. So then our own competitiveness comes into play. And if we're able to stand on our own, albeit 27, albeit, one is shorter, one is slimmer, one is wider, feet, then we will be able to have a role to play at the strategic table. And that will very much depend on how we follow through on many of the things that we have now passed. There's been many new instruments that have been passed, not only on the trade front, but across the board. When you look at 55, there's 13 different instruments. So it's not only about what we do in terms of passing things, but also about implementation. So this will fundamentally change things. Yes, that's what and yes, another point on geopolitical risks and looking at different supply chains. One more advice for companies, not only risk management and invest in analysis, but also talk to your member states. So if you have companies that are specifically coming from one specific member state, it's very important to also know what that member state plans to do, or have your interests properly represented, which I'm sure that 9.9 out of 10 times is the case. But we see what happened in the case of Lithuania. And at this point in time, there is still practically there is an embargo on anything Lithuanian in China. So in order to not to be caught off guard, it's also important to make sure that your capitals are on the one side transparent with you, and on the other hand, that you are aware of some of the things that could be happening. So thanks. Hope it answers at least some of the questions.
Thank you. I think we already have some questions from the audience.
Thank you to the entire panel, very insightful. My name is René Bos. I'm from Amsterdam. I work for RAI, the largest exhibition company in Amsterdam. We have an office in Shanghai. We're still investing in China. Maybe we shouldn't for hearing all the stories, but we're confident. I want to comment on Eva's talk and emphasize on that as a political scientist rather than manager from an SME company. I think when we talk about decoupling, of course, that's nonsense. That's not going to happen, and we shouldn't. De-risking, sure, that should be anybody's strategy. Rebalancing, sure, it should happen. So many missions from EU go to China and talk and wine and dine with those people over there, and we all toast on a mutually beneficial future together between Europe and China. But I think it is illusory to think that in the rebalancing aim that we have, that we can expect China to tone down. That's just simply not going to happen. They're have a very clear set of goals and objectives. They're very focused in reaching those goals and objectives. They have a different set of, let's say, morals and scruples than we have, maybe in Europe or even in the US sometimes. So I think all in all, my take on it is we should be, as Europe, we emphasize too much at how dependent we are on China, how much we allow China to divide and conquer and pick out the weak friends within the European Union. So my call is really, and I should turn it into a question mark because I'm supposed to ask questions, is I think we should, shouldn't we not in the rebalancing make Europe a lot stronger, make sure we speak with more confidence. Chinese respect winners and Chinese respect people who talk with confidence. Shouldn't we do that much more as Europe? and speak more unified, act more unified, and thus enforce a level playing field rather than continuing playing Mr. and Mrs. Nice and going to China and have those fantastic dinner parties with them where we toast again on a mutually beneficial future together, but act a bit like China and be more confident and move forward? Question mark.
My goodness, I wish I went to dinner parties and toasted and be so happy. It's that is not my experience of China. Of course, I agree with you that we need to be more strong, more unified, and more assertive. And this is a message that I always pass to our member states. And this is a message that I also pass to European business. Adam has now left, but he has heard me so many times speaking about the need to speak with one voice. Because and Tudor was mentioning that something else that companies can do is be more in touch with the member states. This is precisely what China very often doesn't want to do. When I was there during the COVID times, I remember one day that we had a meeting of all the different chambers of commerce, the EU, the US, Japan, the different chambers of commerce of all the big trading partners. And they were all explaining how the chief representative of the chamber had much better access to the Chinese government than the minister counselor at the European embassy, or at the embassy where they were. And when it reached my point, I said, yeah, and that is by design. That is exactly what China wants. China wants to deal with individual companies. China wants to cut individual deals. China wants to peel you off from your government and make sure that you don't speak in a united voice with your own government. So indeed, we should all be much more united, much more assertive, and speak with a clear voice. Absolutely. And I think little by little, China does unite us in its vision, because sometimes they just cannot help themselves. About being stronger vis-a-vis China, I think we also are. We have developed a whole set of what we call the autonomous toolbox, which is jargon for a series of trade and investment tools that we didn't have before. The traditional tools that we had were to protect against subsidies and dumping into our internal market. And little by little, we have realized this is not enough. So we have developed tools that deal with kind of more security concerns. We have now EU export controls that we have been revising, and we have investment screening, inward investment screening, sorry, to check who is that is acquiring our companies and are there concerns behind. And there has been an announcement by President von der Leyen that we will look into an initiative about outward investment screening. Within the internal market, we have also imposed rules to try to level the playing field. We have a foreign subsidy regulation to look into how subsidies or companies that are subsidized by third parties operate in the internal market and try to level the playing field. Because in the internal market, we have rules on state aid. So we have been traditionally much more tougher on our own companies than on companies from third countries. So we want to try to level that playing field. We also have an instrument, the International Procurement Instrument, that would allow us to close our open market with respect to selected partners in order to force them to come to the negotiating table and negotiate a reciprocal opening. We have also an instrument that will help us deal with coercive practices, an anti-coercion instrument. All of these instruments we have been developing in the last years, precisely because there has been a realization that in order to deal with a partner like China, and it's not only about China, many of these instruments were devised with other partners in mind, and then China actually gave us fantastic business case, I have to say. But in order to deal with a partner like China, we need strong tools, and we need to be stronger and more assertive, and definitely defend our home ground. At least that here we do have the level playing field that we always had. It's more difficult to force an outward behavior, as you said before. Tudor, you wanted to...
Very quickly. Dag René. Confidence, yes, super important, but confidence comes from coherence and from unity. As nicely mentioned by Eva here. Think about the X+1 format, whether it's 17, 16, 14, whatever. Look at the BRI summit and attendance from European heads of state and government. We are very divided, unfortunately. It's very easy to say that we need to speak with one voice. And I think in every single European document, whether you look at Council conclusions, whether you look at Parliament resolutions, whether Commission communication, whatever, speaking with one voice is always there. But again, we need to make a difference between theory and practice. The good news, I think, is that when you look at public perception on China, things have been changing gradually, especially in the aftermath of COVID. So I think there were multiple reports by think tanks and whatnot that were saying that in rather many member states, confidence is low. So there is also a pressure from the public side to account more for some of the challenges that come from China, pressure on the government. But I think a fundamental source of complexity on speaking with one voice and in applying all these fantastic instruments that Eva has mentioned in a very effective and efficient manner is the issue of competences. We have this problem at the level of the European Union that the competence mix is extremely, difficult to understand, even for people that work in Brussels. So you had the example of COVID. Yeah, the EU should do more. Yeah, but the EU doesn't have competence on that front. The EU should do more on investment screening. It does if the member states let it. So again, this dialogue is very important for it to happen with the EU because we get all the signals that more is expected of us. But this dialogue needs to happen in every single member state capital through chambers of commerce, through individual discussions with embassies, so on and so forth, to also get member states to play ball. So these are just my 5 cents on your point.
I also think that we need to take into account the process that we've already been through in trying to speak with that one voice. If you look at like what happened in terms of discussions 10 years ago, I think you were looking at a very different landscape there. I think, that has been a process, I think, since 2017, 18 already, where, increasingly the EU is trying to speak with one voice. But of course, you can't start from scratch and then expect to be there at the end of the road. I do believe that there is already a lot of work that has been done. And if you look at the different member states' perspectives, I think there is already some, emergence of that one voice. Increasingly, of course, also, as you mentioned, because of the challenges vis-a-vis China, and especially since COVID, I think there are a lot of things that have been on the agenda. Also, if you look at like the EU summits at the council level, to a certain extent, the number of times that China has been on the agenda there, there is a lot of effort being done in creating that one voice. Of course, not all member states are always aligned on every single topic. And I think that is work in progress, but I think it's also a member state, up to the member states to a certain extent, to see the need or the use of the EU there and the role that the EU can play, rather than playing solo slim to a certain extent. And that is a process that is ongoing. We're making progress, but I don't think we're there yet.
It has been very interesting, actually, what I hear. And I lived in China for 20 years, okay? So I know China quite well. And I came back 10 years ago, and I came back because I wanted to come back, okay? Not because I had been pushed to come back. But there's something what we are talking now, what we are discussing now, actually, we knew already 15 years ago, 20 years ago, because China published everything. Every 5 years, they make the 5 years plan. So we knew already in 2025, they wanted to reach the technology independence or whatever. So why we are just discussing right now? Probably because China has grown her influence, her activity throughout the world. This is the first point. The second point is, this is actually what I do believe also the European level we should understand. So why we right now we raise our voice to say you must be okay. So now you treat them as a partner, as a competitor at the same level. And I like very much what it has been said before. We should look for some common ground to discuss. Not only you have to open the market because our market are more open or whatever. Find out some clues, some issues to discuss together. I like very much, for instance, the standard settings. This is very interesting, okay? You discuss about standard setting and you listen to what they say also, okay? This is the first. The second, said that we should discuss among European community all the countries in the states, member states, and so whatever. I do believe also we should listen to Chinese companies invested in Europe. This is another point nobody told you. Whenever we talk about Chinese access to European access to Chinese market, whatever, I always say that China is a system, is not only a country, is not only a market. So you deal with Chinese company here. If I'm a small and medium enterprise, I don't need to go to China to discuss with Alibaba. Before Enzo Israel was saying e-commerce is very important, I deal with Alibaba here in Europe, and I deal with them and the export through Alibaba here. So what I'm thinking, that it is also important to listen to what Chinese companies also said about European market and how they could bridge in order to lease with their mother country, because it's very important too. And this, we go back to a kind of cultural relationship, which is actually the base of everything. So this is actually what I'm thinking. Thank you.
I like that China never changed, because it is true. The Chinese also say that themselves. Indeed, they have always subsidized our companies. They have always dumped in our markets. They have always had state-owned enterprises. They have always forced technology transfer. This is indeed, they have always done that. Why are we worried now? Because of the size of the Chinese economy and the size of the distortion and the damage that that creates now on our economies. It is not the same. The China that joined the WTO, that did all of those things, is not the same as the China that we see 20 years on. And the damage that it creates in our industries is not the same. So, but you're right. And I think we are getting a little bit also better at reading what China says, because many of the things that they do, they say, and we do not react. We read them. And somehow we don't, I don't know, maybe we don't want to really understand what they're saying, but they do say things very clearly, like that the Chinese rice bowl has to have Chinese grain in it. They say it, but still we think like, oh, but no, but I'm sure there's a space for me. Yes, there is space in some areas, but not a lot. About finding common ground, we try. Again, it takes two to tango. It is really very difficult to try to find areas of common ground with China. And standards should be an area where we should be looking for common ground. But I think it's also an area of enormous competition. And China has made also that choice of having its own standards, again, in China for China. There's a lot of discussions about decoupling, but I think that, yeah, those like you that know China best, they know that they were driving for self-sufficiency and for cutting themselves off the rest of the world, not being dependent on the rest of the world for a very long time ago. And the Chinese also tell us to listen to the Chinese companies in the EU, and they set up a Chinese Chamber of Commerce in the EU, I think to mirror the type of work that the European Chamber of Commerce in China is doing. And yeah, they tell us the same as the government is telling us, that we are becoming protectionist, which it thinks like it's the pot calling the kettle black. It really, I don't find that we are protectionist. I think we are leveling the playing field, and we are protecting our industry. Is not the same as being protectionist. We have to listen to them. I hear them. I hear Huawei all the time telling me about how concerned they are about market access. So I understand that Huawei has between 30 and 40% of the European market, and our two vendors combined in China have around 3% of the Chinese market. And still they complain about market access and lack of level playing field. I think the situation is just not comparable. It's not comparable. I do understand that they have concerns. I do think that there's a lot of anti-China buzzwords going around, and that is not correct, and it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be against any country in particular, and it shouldn't be about decoupling. So I do think that the Chinese companies in the EU feel also a little bit like the geopolitics are against them. But we have always welcomed competition as long as it is fair. The European Union is built on competition. We didn't build the common market that we have by protecting and creating national champions. We believe in competition. As long as it is fair, I think we will remain open and welcoming, but it's the unfair competition that we're concerned about. I think Tudor wanted to add. He felt like, no? I don't know. Someone?
You're already feeling my mimics here. I agree with you on several points. we've been talking a lot about Made in China 2025, much later than it was announced. Now, for instance, we're not talking very much about China Standards 2035, and it's again, we might be late to the game. It's not only Chinese standard for China, I would compliment, but also they're exporting Chinese standards, and you have the GID or the GIS on development and security, where China is rather assertively and convincingly persuading third parties to take up some of these standards. I agree with you, there are cultural differences and much more needs to be invested in understanding one another. And we need to find areas to build trust. And I think we tried this, for instance, in the European Parliament. We tried this with the Geographic Indications Agreement, which we said it's a low-hanging fruit. We're going to have this. It's 100 products from the EU, 100 products from China. This will be updated soon. Let's see. And we'll then move to CAI, and then we'll build other things. There were people that were already calling for an FTA after the investment agreement, so on and so forth. However, then come the sanctions, then come many other things that you build a bit of trust here and then you lose this much trust. So it's not one step forward, 2 steps back, but 2 steps forward and 10 steps back. So it's not that we are in the business of China bashing. This is something that we have particularly stressed very often in the European Parliament, because there are many politicians that feel free because they're politicians and they have their mandate, and some of them want to have headlines, others simply just want to say what they want to say because that's their democratic right, to speak their mind. But there are some legitimate concerns. So for instance, on the issue of sanctions and the imbalance between, because we're talking a lot about rebalancing, the European Union, yeah, so not the European Parliament, the European Union sanctions some authorities from the Xinjiang region for legitimate reasons on human rights related matters. China then sanctions MEPs of the European Parliament for speaking out their mind, for exercising their legitimate right as an elected member of this house. This makes our situation very difficult. So it's not easy to then go out into the press and say, no, but we should discuss. Come on. I mean, so it's not that we don't want to, but we are sometimes having our lives made very difficult by some of the actions taken by Beijing.
I think also like an aspect of competition, as you mentioned, I think that's a positive thing in itself, as long as you play by the same rules. If you're playing by the same rules in the same game, it's fine. If you're playing the same game, each with your own rules, it might be difficult to find even any outcome at some point. So I think to that extent, I mean, that is probably the direction to go for, like trying to find the same rules and to find the common ground to actually discuss that, which is difficult at this moment, apparently. I think also if you look at the reality in China and looking at where they are now and where maybe from a Western perspective, there were expectations where China would have gone. I think that is maybe also on our own account in like being naive in like, well, yes, they'll just change the way we will, I mean, or the way we want them to. I don't think China to a certain extent has ever promised that they would. They might have given the impression at some point that they might have had, I mean, I think also a shift internally at some point and different direction to take. The question is more how to get them back around the table and to come to those common rules and those common grounds. And that seems to be more complicated as ever. So it might take a lot of time.
About the China never promised. Well, when China joined the WTO, I think the WTO is a club of market economies committed to trade openness and liberalization. This is the basis of WTO. When it joined the WTO, there was the expectation that it would continue trade liberalization, that it would be a market economy. And I think the situation is completely different. Some of the commitments that China undertook when joining the WTO were, for instance, to refrain from forced technology transfer. And yeah, of course, they say that this is forbidden and this doesn't happen. But I have spoken with plenty of companies that, of course, tell me that there is forced technology transfer, and you see it year after year, still in the business confidence survey of the European Chamber of Commerce in China. Another promise that they made were that the state-owned enterprises would abide solely by commercial considerations. This is completely the opposite of what President Xi Jinping publicly says. So I think there were promises about the direction in which China was going that have not been held, and that have forced also a correction of course in our economies.
This imbalance not expected to be changed in the short term, but also we keep being in China on the ground. We see more SMEs are being heavily localized. How much are they contributing eventually to the economy here?
You were talking about the growth and jobs and the localization, and indeed I remember when it was in 2021, yes, 2021, the business confidence survey of the European Chamber of Commerce in China showed that that the companies were assessing that they were living in a more geopolitical environment, and there were lots of risks, and there had been the risks of the disruption of the supply chain, particularly during COVID. And before that, it was the US-China tariff war. And the strategy that the companies were putting in place at that point of time was actually to onshore more and more parts of the supply chain into China. And I said at the beginning that when I spoke before, that the European Union has always supported investment abroad because of the growth and job that it brings back home. We care for the long-term competitiveness of the European industry, of the European Union, not for the maximization of shareholder profit in a short period of time, which is, I'm afraid, the aim of many a company, and that is okay. It's what companies do. It's not a public policy objective that I am going to support or encourage. So I think that the growth and job brought back home by investment abroad is not to be taken for granted at every case, unfortunately. And that we need to also look into a longer term stability and prosperity. Something that has been concerning me for a very long time is not just the jobs that may move from the European Union to China when companies delocalize, when companies onshore further bits of the supply chain in China. There's also bits of their supply chain that is moved from our neighborhood, which was our belt of prosperity and stability. And those jobs, the suppliers that are companies that were manufacturing in Europe had in, I don't know, in Eastern Europe or in Northern Africa, in Morocco, in Tunisia and Turkey, those jobs are also moved out of that belt of prosperity and stability that we had around Europe. And that is something that actually really worries me very, very much, how that impacts the standing of the European Union, our political power, but also our internal security and stability.
Thank you very much. Easy question, very complex answer. So game changer. The very bad thing that could happen is anything happening in Taiwan. That would be a massive game changer for many companies around. On the positive side, I would say we need to manage expectations. So start low and keep building. Let's find one specific sector where we can have an agreement, where we can show that cooperation works, where we set rules and we abide by them, and that can potentially then spill over into other areas. As a general rule of thumb, or as a concluding remark, let's say, I would say that we need a smart strategy. Yeah, which now hear me out, because I'm also a politician, academic, both sides. It's a mix for a fun mix. So a smart strategy. Yeah, we need to be sustainable first of all. So we need to. This is, I think, one of the areas where the EU and China can work together. And it's not only sustainability as a sector, but it's also as investments. Let's say. So companies need legal certainty and transparency. We need to make sure that the goalpost will not be moved mid-game. Secondly, we need to act as much as possible multilaterally, even though right now it's very difficult, and the WTO is in the middle of an identity crisis to some extent. multilateralism can deliver. When multilateralism is not possible, we need to build alliances at the plurilateral level in order to make sure that we abide by rules. So rules-based, and it's we need trust. This is the fundamental thing. Without trust, we cannot do anything. We cannot even begin to understand one another. We cannot even try to once again say that any kind of agreement is worth more than the paper that it's written on. This would be something that we're looking at. Of course, again, from the side of the European Parliament, sorry, I keep on hammering this down, but I'm coming from that institution. As long as the sanctions are in place, nothing can be done. So a game changer in that sense would be possibly a change of a situation at the level of the sanctions.
I want to answer your question too. What changed? What's the game changer? So my name is Johnny Prowise. Well, I think the game changed last week. And China looks at power and doesn't expose itself. That's part of their culture. You know, they are very much looking at power, but they don't expose themselves. They don't reveal themselves. Now, the last 20 years, they've been accepting investment a lot from Europe, from US, and they grew from that. Actually, we grew from that together. But despite what we thought, it did not influence them. It did not change them. So the 5-year plans, indeed, they are consequent. But the vision has changed because we have had an, let's call it between brackets, an unexpected election in China not so long time ago. And you know what I mean with that. So the vision has changed, but the machine is still running. Now, we really need to realize that because now they're acting from a power position. In the past, we were acting from a power position. That's why we were allowed to basically expand and do certain things in China. But they never really accepted a different way of thinking. Now, we must look into our heart because we always have to realize our way of thinking is also just our way of thinking. And we have an amount of people on this globe, and they also have an amount of people on this globe. Now, their people also have an idea about their leader. And there also are different voices. It's very interesting to see what's going to happen there. But I will conclude. So now they're acting from a power position. Now they're not so much looking at our market alone, and we are not supposed to look at their market alone. We basically are looking at global markets together now, because the Belt and Road Initiative, last week, that meeting was so meaningful. And what we need to understand is they have a central plan economy. That's just how they work. Their philosophy is that if they want to make something happen, they have a state economy, state capitalism, basically to execute on that. And if we want to play on the game locally to protect ourselves, also there to still look at their market, but most importantly, on the global level, to figure out how we want to work together, we have to understand they are now in a power position and they think from a central plan economy perspective. Now, central plan economy has its advantages and its disadvantages, and that's worth another debate.
We are coming to the end of our discussion for this morning, and thank you again to our three speakers, Eva, Tudor, Lynn, for your interesting sharing.